The morning Chidi Okafor told his 7 months pregnant wife he was leaving her for her sister, he had no idea that Adaeze Nwosu Okafor was the silent majority shareholder who owned 73% of Okafor Tech Solutions, the technology startup he'd spent 4 years building in the relentless Lagos hustle, the company he believed he'd created from nothing through his own genius and grit. Adaeze stood in the living room of their modest 3-bedroom duplex in Lekki Phase 1, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly where their daughter kicked anxiously, watching her husband fold designer Menegildo Zegna shirts and Italian leather shoes into a Louis Vuitton suitcase, while her sister Ngozi waited outside in a gleaming white Range Rover Sport. A vehicle Adaeze happened to know was leased and already 3 months behind on payments, and she felt something cold, final, and surprisingly liberating settle in her chest. He was leaving her, swollen ankles, gestational diabetes, sleepless nights and all, for Ngozi, the sister everyone called the successful one, the woman with the carefully curated Instagram aesthetic and designer wardrobe who treated their mother's bukka in satellite town like it was beneath her dignity. Abandoning their marriage and unborn child for someone he thought was his equal in ambition and sophistication, never suspecting that his wife had been the invisible hand injecting capital into his company, the ghost investor who'd approved every major contract, the silent partner who quite literally owned the ground beneath his expensive Italian shoes. But what would happen when the man who called her a local girl with no vision discovered that his wife was the angel investor he'd been thanking God and his hard work for? The secret benefactor who'd injected 47 million Nigerian nairas into his startup, paid for the prestigious Victoria Island office he loved to brag about on LinkedIn, and quietly saved his company from collapse 3 separate times when clients delayed payment? How would Chidi react when the wife he dismissed as just a nurse with a small salary and no business sense revealed that she owned majority shares in his precious tech company, that every major contract he celebrated, GTBank, MTN, Interswitch, had been secured through her grandmother's legendary business connections, that even the MacBook Pro he used to pitch investors had been purchased with her money? And what would Adaeze do to the husband who'd betrayed her trust now that she finally had permission to stop hiding her power and show him exactly what it meant to discard the woman who'd built his empire from the shadows while he slept beside her, oblivious? Adaeze had perfected the art of strategic silence over 4.5 years of marriage, a skill inherited from her late grandmother, Mama Adaeze. She'd attended tech conferences and industry mixers as Chidi's wife, smiled politely while his colleagues patronized her about keeping busy at home, and asked when she'd leave nursing to support her husband's career full-time, and never corrected anyone who assumed she was just another entrepreneur's wife living off her husband's success. The truth was far more complex, layered with a kind of wisdom that only came from watching a master manipulate power from behind a curtain of assumed ordinariness. Her grandmother, Adaeze Nwosu, had built a trading empire spanning Lagos, Onitsha, and Aba, importing textiles from China and electronics from Taiwan, quietly amassing a fortune worth 280 million Nigerian nairas while letting her husband take credit publicly, shake hands with politicians, and bask in the glory of being called chief. The old woman had understood something profound about power. Visible authority attracted envy and enemies, but invisible control attracted truth. When she died 3 years ago in a private room at Reddington Hospital, she left everything to Adaeze, her only granddaughter who'd actually listened, who'd studied not just nursing at the University of Lagos, but had also secretly completed an MBA from Lagos Business School, who understood that real wealth moved in silence while poverty screamed for attention on Instagram. *NWAM*. Mama Adaeze had whispered during their final conversation, her weathered hand, scarred from decades of counting money and loading goods, gripping Adaeze with surprising strength. A wise woman builds her husband's house, but a wiser woman owns the land it stands on. Let him think he's the king. Let him wear the crown and make the speeches. But never forget who actually holds the power. Her eyes, cloudy with approaching death, but sharp with accumulated wisdom, had held Adaeze's gaze. When you marry, watch carefully. Does he love you, or does he love what you can do for him? That's the test every woman of means must administer. And most men fail. She'd maintained the facade perfectly, even from Chidi. They'd met at Chioma's wedding in Enugu 4.5 years ago, where he'd been the charming groomsman with big dreams, a 29-year-old software engineer at Main One with an infectious laugh and ambitious energy that reminded her of her father. He'd pursued her with romantic determination, surprise visits to Reddington Hospital with her favorite chin-chin from her mother's shop, late-night phone conversations about faith and future, handwritten notes quoting scripture about Ruth and Boaz, destiny and divine partnership. He'd seemed genuinely unbothered by her simple life as a nurse earning 250,000 Nigerian nairas monthly, claiming he loved her for her compassion, her intelligence, her quiet strength that didn't need validation from designer bags or luxury vacations. They'd married within 18 months, a modest traditional ceremony in her village, where Mama Ezen had watched from her wheelchair with knowing eyes, followed by a small white wedding at Redeemed Christian Church in Lekki. Chidi's family had been impressed by the Nwosu's evident respectability, the well-maintained family compound, her father's retired civil service background, her mother's popular bukka, though Adaeze had been meticulously careful not to reveal the full extent of her grandmother's wealth sitting in investment accounts and property portfolios across eastern Nigeria. She'd wanted Chidi to love her for herself, not for an inheritance that could turn genuine affection into calculated transaction. What Chidi didn't know was that Adaeze had orchestrated his company's salvation just 8 months into their marriage. She'd watched her husband come home night after night, deflated and desperate, explaining that his dream of launching Okafor Tech Solutions was dying before it could breathe. He needed 20 million Nigerian nairas for office space in a respectable location, Victoria Island, not some backwater in Ikeja, for equipment, business licensing, initial operating capital, and 6 months of runway to pursue contracts. His applications for bank loans had been rejected due to insufficient collateral. His Main One salary barely covered their rent and her pregnancy expenses. His dreams, he'd said with tears that seemed genuine at the time, were slipping through his fingers like sand. Adaeze had watched her husband's pain and made a calculated decision, the way Mama Ezen had taught her. She'd contacted her grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Obiora, a 58-year-old man with a salt-and-pepper beard and the patient demeanor of someone who'd structured deals for powerful women for 3 decades and created an investment vehicle called Ezen Holdings Limited. The money would flow to Chidi as angel investor funding from an anonymous high-net-worth individual impressed by his business plan. The investment documents would be written in corporate legalese dense enough that an excited entrepreneur wouldn't read carefully. He would never know the investor was his wife, sitting beside him in bed while he celebrated, cooking his favorite ofe nsala while he called family members to share the good news. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Mr. Obiora had asked in his quiet Ikoyi office, his eyebrows raised skeptically above his reading glasses. "If this marriage encounters difficulties, Adaeze, you could lose this entire investment. 20 million Nigerian nairas is not a small amount to gamble on a man's character." "My husband has dreams," Adaeze had replied firmly, one hand already resting on her barely showing pregnancy bump. "I want to help him achieve them. If he succeeds because I believed in him when no one else did, that's a blessing from God. If he succeeds and forgets where the blessing came from." She'd left the sentence unfinished, but something hard and resolute had flickered in her eyes. Mama Ezen's eyes, Mr. Obiora had thought, something that suggested this young woman understood exactly what test she was administering. For 3.5 years, it had worked better than she'd hoped. Okafor Tech Solutions launched with a beautiful glass-walled office on Adeola Odika Street, 6 hungry employees, and enough capital to pursue contracts aggressively. Chidi had been euphoric, attributing his success to hard work, strategic networking, and God's divine favor. Adaeze had smiled and cooked his favorite meals, attended his office parties as the supportive wife, and never hinted that she'd read every quarterly financial report Mr. Obiora forwarded, that she'd approved every major disbursement through encrypted email communications, that she'd personally called her grandmother's old business partner at GT Bank to ensure Chidi's proposal received serious consideration. She'd injected 2 more capital infusions, Nigerian naira 15 million when GTBank delayed payment for 3 months and the company nearly collapsed under payroll pressure, and another 12 million Nigerian nairas to expand into the lucrative cybersecurity services market. Each time, the money came through Adaeze Holdings with Mr. Obiora's carefully worded letters praising Chidi's impressive business acumen and strategic vision. Each time, Chidi had celebrated with champagne and proclamations about his own genius, never suspecting that the anonymous investor was the woman whose swollen feet he'd stopped massaging, whose medical shifts he'd stopped asking about, whose opinions on business matters he'd begun dismissing with increasing condescension. But something had changed as Okafor Tech Solutions grew from a struggling startup into a company landing contracts worth tens of millions of naira. Chidi's humble gratitude had curdled into arrogant pride. Success had revealed character, just as Mama Adaeze had predicted, and the revelation was devastating. He'd started calling himself a self-made entrepreneur in interviews with Techaball and TechPoint Africa, claiming he'd built everything from nothing with no help from anyone. He'd purchased expensive clothes from Alera and a Mercedes-Benz C-Class financed through the company's growing cash flow. He developed a taste for the exclusive clubs in Victoria Island, Quilox, Escape, DNA, where he networked with serious people who operated at a certain level. The worst change, however, was how he began treating Adaeze. The man who'd once praised her nursing career as noble and selfless now made cutting comments about her small salary and lack of business vision. He'd started suggesting she should quit Reddington to become a full-time housewife, or perhaps start a small side business selling hair extensions or clothes like other wives to keep herself occupied. "You don't understand the corporate world," he told her one evening when she'd offered advice on a contract dispute, his tone casual but slicing. "Just focus on cooking and taking care of the home when the baby comes. Leave business strategy to people who actually know what they're doing." She'd bitten her tongue, reminding herself of her grandmother's test, telling herself that Chidi was just stressed from managing rapid growth, that success sometimes brought temporary arrogance that would fade with maturity and spiritual counseling. But the comments escalated, especially after her sister Ngozi moved back to Lagos from London 6 months ago. And then came the affair. The late nights attributed to investor meetings. The password-protected phone. The sudden interest in expensive cologne, Tom Ford Noir, and designer underwear. The private investigator's report delivered to her in the hospital parking lot after a grueling 12-hour shift, 7 months pregnant and exhausted, detailing 8 weeks of betrayal photographed in high resolution. Chidi and Ngozi at Knock by Alera sharing dessert at a boutique hotel in Ikoyi, checking in together on a Thursday afternoon when he'd claimed to have a meeting at Eco Hotel at the Lekki beach where he'd proposed to Adaeze 3 years earlier, laughing while Ngozi tried on engagement rings at Alera with Chidi watching approvingly. Adaeze had sat in her car, 7 months pregnant with her husband's child, reading the investigator's clinical prose. Subject and companion appear to be in an intimate relationship. Overheard conversations suggesting marriage plans following subject's divorce from current wife. Female companion appears primarily focused on subject's perceived wealth and business success. Multiple references to building our empire together and when we're married. And felt her heart break beneath the weight of absolute disillusionment. She'd given him everything while hiding who she was, administering Mama Adaze's test with scientific precision. And he'd failed spectacularly, revealing himself to be exactly the kind of man her grandmother had warned about, one who loved what a woman could do for him rather than who she actually was. He was leaving a secret millionaire for a fake socialite, abandoning the woman who'd built his empire for a sister whose Range Rover was leased and 3 months delinquent, whose designer clothes were rented from the dress library for Instagram photos, whose successful business in London had actually been a job as a shop assistant at Primark in Stratford. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so devastatingly much. She debated confronting him immediately, showing up at Ngozi's Banana Island apartment, paid for with money borrowed from their retired parents, and exposing everything. But Mr. Obiora had counseled strategic patience. Let them make their move, he'd advised in his quiet office, pushing a box of tissues across his desk while Adaeze cried for the first time in front of him. "Right now you have moral injury, yes. But if you wait, if you let them act on their plans, you'll have legal grounds and maximum leverage. Your grandmother used to say, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. Let him make the mistake completely. Then show him who actually holds the power. So she'd waited. 3 weeks of watching them together at her own home, of enduring Ngozi's smug touches on Chidi's arm, of hearing her husband compare them. Your sister really understands ambition, Adaeze. She gets what it takes to succeed in this Lagos. Maybe you should learn from her. While their daughter kicked inside her belly as if sensing her mother's distress. 3 weeks of preparation. Securing documents, consulting corporate lawyers, preparing the shareholder disclosure that would detonate Chidi's entire reality. 3 weeks of maintaining the facade while plotting the systematic destruction of everything he thought he'd built. But then came this morning. The morning that changed everything. The morning Chidi emerged from their bedroom with packed suitcases and the audacity to throw her out of a home she technically owned, to dismiss 4 years of marriage with cruel efficiency, to walk toward a future with her sister while she stood there, 7 months pregnant, holding the power to destroy him completely. The test was over, and Chidi Okafor had failed more completely than even Mama Adaeze could have predicted. Now came the reckoning. The memory of Mama Adaze's death always came to Adaeze in fragments, sharp, crystalline moments that cut through time like broken glass catching light. Standing in her living room watching Chidi pack, feeling their daughter's anxious kicks against her palm, she found herself pulled backward 3 years to that private room at Reddington Hospital, where everything had changed. Her grandmother had looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, diminished by the cancer that had ravaged her body, but not her spirit. At 73, Adaeze Nwosu had built an empire that spanned 3 of Nigeria's most important commercial cities, Lagos, Onitsha, and Aba, importing textiles from Guangzhou and electronics from Taipei, moving containers through Apapa port with the efficiency of someone who'd greased the right palms and cultivated the right relationships over 4 decades of relentless trading. 280 million Nigerian nairas. That's what the estate was worth when Mr. Obiora finally tallied everything. The warehouses in Idemota and Balogun markets, the residential properties in Ikoyi and Lekki, the commercial buildings in Onitsha and Aba, the investment portfolios quietly growing in accounts at First Bank and Zenith, the shares in telecommunications companies and real estate developments that Mama Adaeze had purchased with the patient foresight of someone who understood that old money whispered while new money screamed. But the true inheritance wasn't the money. It was the lesson. *NWAM*, come closer. Mama Adaeze had whispered that final afternoon, her voice already thin as paper, her hand, scarred from decades of loading goods, counting naira notes, negotiating with Chinese suppliers who underestimated the small African woman with the fierce eyes, gripping Adaeze with surprising strength. I need to tell you something your mother never understood. Something your sisters will never understand. Are you listening? Adaeze had leaned in, smelling the hospital antiseptic mixed with the faint scent of the traditional osaji her grandmother insisted on wearing even in her final days. Yes, Mama. Your grandfather, Chief Nwosu, everyone called him a great man, successful businessman, respected elder. You remember how they praised him at gatherings, how politicians came to seek his blessing. The old woman's laugh was bitter, knowing. Do you know what made Chief Nwosu great? Me. Every kobo he claimed to have made, every business deal he boasted about in those men-only meetings at the village square, every property titled in his name. I built that. I sourced the suppliers. I negotiated the contracts. I managed the money. I bribed the customs officials. I knew which politicians to pay and when. Adaeze had known this, of course. Everyone in the family knew, though no one spoke it aloud. It was the open secret that hovered over every family gathering. That Mama Adaeze was the true architect of the Nwosu fortune while Chief Nwosu played the public role, shaking hands and collecting honors. But I let him have the glory, Mama Adaeze continued, her eyes sharp despite the morphine coursing through her fore. I let him wear the chief's cap and the igbada. Let him give speeches at ceremonies and pretend to be the big man. You know why? Because visible power attracts enemies. Visible wealth attracts jealousy, investigations, kidnappers, armed robbers, family members who want a share of what you've built. But invisible power? Invisible wealth. She tapped her temple with one gnarled finger. That operates in silence. That's what gave me freedom. I understand, Mama. No, you don't. Not yet. But you will. The old woman had paused, gathering strength. A wise woman builds her husband's house. But a wiser woman owns the land it stands on. Do you see the difference? One is visible labor. The other is invisible control. When you marry, and I know you've been seeing that main one boy, don't think I don't know, you need to test him. Does he love you for who you are, or for what you can do for him? Most men fail that test, and most men fail spectacularly. The inheritance documents had been filed with Mr. Obiora 3 months before her death, everything meticulously organized with the precision of a woman who'd spent her life managing complex operations. To Adaeze, her youngest granddaughter, the only one who'd actually listened during those long afternoons in Onitsha when Mama Adaeze explained business strategy while pretending to teach her how to cook oaf akwu, everything. The money, the properties, the business connections, the carefully maintained relationships with suppliers in China and Taiwan, the trust fund that could generate 2 million Nigerian nairas monthly in passive income alone. To Adaeze's mother and sisters, token amounts, enough to feel included, but not enough to squander. She knows you studied business, Mr. Obiora had explained at the will reading, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone who'd structured deals for powerful women for 3 decades. She knew about the MBA you completed at Lagos Business School, while everyone thought you were just doing nursing shifts. She knew you were different from your sisters. She knew you understood. What Mama Adaeze had understood, what she taught Adaeze through stories and silences, was that true power moved like water, finding the lowest places, filling every crack and crevice, shaping landscapes without announcing its presence until it carved canyons through mountains. Adaeze had taken that lesson to heart, particularly in choosing whom to marry. They'd met at Chioma's wedding in Enugu 4.5 years ago, one of those elaborate Saturday ceremonies where the bride's family had rented out the entire grounds of Nike Lake Hotel and the groomsmen wore matching burgundy agbada that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Adaeze had been 26, recently finished with her nursing degree from University of Lagos, secretly completing weekend classes toward her MBA at Lagos Business School, and thoroughly unimpressed by the parade of ambitious young men her mother kept trying to introduce her to. This one works at Access Bank, assistant manager at 28, her mother would whisper urgently. That one is a lawyer at Udo Udoma and Bello Oseji. Do you know how prestigious that is? Sister Ngozi, come and talk to Adaeze about these opportunities she's wasting. But Chidi had been different. Or so it had seemed. He'd approached her at the reception with none of the aggressive confidence of the banking and legal types circling the unmarried women like sharks sensing blood. He'd been the groomsman who carried the bride's younger cousin when she'd twisted her ankle dancing, the one who'd helped the elderly guests find seats in the shade, the one who'd noticed when Adaeze had slipped away to the quiet garden area behind the venue because the noise and heat had become overwhelming. Too much Lagos energy for one day? He'd asked, appearing beside her with 2 bottles of chilled water and a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I saw you escaping. Thought you might need this. They talked for 2 hours in that garden, the wedding celebration providing background noise while they discovered each other in conversation. Chidi Okafor, 29, software engineer at Main One, originally from Enugu but living in Yaba. Ambitious but not aggressively so, funny without trying too hard, interested in technology and innovation but also in faith and family. He talked about his dreams of building something meaningful, not just another tech company, but something that actually solves problems for Nigerian businesses, with genuine passion that reminded her of her father's stories about the civil service's better days. What about you? He'd asked. What does Adaeze Nwosu dream about? Helping people, she'd answered honestly, keeping her business studies secret as Mama Adaeze had taught her. That's why I chose nursing. I want to make a difference in people's lives when they're most vulnerable. That's beautiful, he'd said, and the sincerity in his voice had seemed real. Not many people choose service over success these days. The courtship that followed had felt like something from a Nollywood romance, the kind with the honest love story beneath the drama. Chidi had pursued her with determined romanticism. Surprise visits to Reddington Hospital after her shifts with her favorite chin-chin from her mother's bukka in Satellite Town, late-night phone conversations that stretched past midnight as they talked about everything from theology to technology, handwritten notes quoting scripture about Ruth and Boaz, about divine partnerships and God's timing. Critically, and this was what had convinced Adaeze he might be different, Chidi had seemed genuinely unbothered by her simple life. Her 250,000 Nigerian nairas monthly nursing salary. Her modest shared apartment in Surulere with 2 roommates. Her preference for mama put over expensive restaurants, for Danfo buses over Uber when she wasn't rushed. He'd claimed to love her for her compassion, her intelligence, her quiet strength that didn't need designer bags or luxury vacations for validation. I've dated women who only cared about what I could buy them. He confided 3 months into their relationship, sitting in her tiny apartment eating jollof rice she'd cooked. Women who wanted a man with a Mercedes and a house in Ikoyi. You're different, Adaeze. You're real. That's what I need. Someone who loves me for who I am, not what I have or might have. Those words, Adaeze would later realize with bitter irony, should have been her first warning. People who protested too loudly about not caring about money often cared about it most of all. They'd married within 18 months. A traditional ceremony in her village, where Mama Ezen had watched from her wheelchair with knowing eyes, her expression unreadable as she observed Chidi's family marveling at the Nwosu's evident respectability, without suspecting the full depth of wealth carefully hidden behind modest presentations. The white wedding followed at Redeemed Christian Church in Lekki, a small ceremony with fewer than 200 guests, elegant but not ostentatious. Adaeze had been meticulously careful throughout, revealing nothing about her inheritance. The money from Mama Ezen sat quietly in investment accounts, untouched. She'd continued working at Reddington, continued living modestly, continued playing the role of simple nurse married to ambitious engineer. She'd wanted Chidi to love her for herself, not for an inheritance that could transform genuine affection into calculated transaction. She'd wanted to administer Mama Ezen's test perfectly. She just hadn't expected him to fail it so completely. The test's first real challenge came 8 months into marriage, when Adaeze was 3 months pregnant and Chidi's dream began dying before it could breathe. She'd watched her husband deteriorate night after night, coming home from Main One defeated and desperate. He'd been planning his exit for months. Okafor Tech Solutions, a company that would provide technology solutions for Nigerian businesses struggling with digital transformation. He'd developed the business plan, identified the market opportunity, even secured preliminary interest from potential clients. But he needed 20 million Nigerian nairas for the foundation, office space in Victoria Island, not some backwater in Ikeja, where no serious client will visit, equipment, business licensing, initial operating capital, 6 months of runway to pursue contracts aggressively. His loan applications had been rejected by every bank. Insufficient collateral. Insufficient credit history. Insufficient proof of concept. His Main One salary of 450,000 Nigerian nairas monthly barely covered their rent in Lekki Phase 1 and her pregnancy expenses. His savings totaled 3.5 million Nigerian nairas, enough for perhaps 2 months of operation in a cheap location, not nearly enough for the launch he envisioned. "It's dying, Adaeze," he'd said one evening, sitting on their bed with his head in his hands, voice thick with tears that seemed genuine at the time. "I can feel it dying. This opportunity, this dream God placed in my heart, it's slipping through my fingers like sand. I'm going to be working for someone else my whole life, watching other people build what I could have built, what I should have built. I'm going to be 40 years old still coding for Main One while younger guys become successful." Adaeze had watched her husband's pain and made a calculated decision, exactly as Mama Ezen had taught her. This was the test. Would Chidi remain humble and grateful if success came? Would he remember the woman who'd believed in him when his dreams seemed impossible? Or would prosperity reveal character flaws that poverty and struggle had temporarily obscured? She'd called Mr. Obiora the next morning from the hospital parking lot during her break. "I need to make an investment," she'd said simply. Mr. Obiora's office in Ikoyi occupied the third floor of a discreet building on Awolowo Road, the kind of place where Nigeria's quiet wealth managed its affairs away from the ostentatious displays of Victoria Island. At 58, Tobias Obiora had spent 3 decades structuring deals for women like Mama Adaeze, the invisible architects of Nigerian commerce, who'd learned that power wielded from shadows lasted longer than power flaunted in daylight. He'd listened to Adaeze's proposal with the patient attention of someone who'd heard similar stories before, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his expression revealing nothing. 20 million naira, he'd repeated when she finished. "For your husband's startup. Structured as anonymous angel investor funding, so he never knows the money came from you." "Exactly. And if the marriage fails? If this investment proves that your husband loves what you can do for him rather than who you are?" Mr. Obiora had removed his reading glasses, polishing them with deliberate care. "You could lose everything you've put in, Adaeze. 20 million Nigerian nairas is not a small amount to gamble on a man's character." "My husband has dreams," Adaeze had replied firmly, one hand resting on her barely visible pregnancy bump where her daughter was just beginning to make her presence known. "I want to help him achieve them. I want to be the woman who believed in him when nobody else did, who gave him the chance he needed. But I also need to know." She'd paused, choosing words carefully. "Does he love me? Or does he love what I can do for him? That's the question my grandmother taught me to ask. That's the test every woman of means must administer. And if he fails the test..." Something hard and resolute had flickered in Adaeze's eyes then. Mama Adaze's eyes, Mr. Obiora had thought, the same cold fire he'd seen in the old woman when business partners betrayed contracts or family members got greedy. "Then I'll know exactly who I married," Adaeze had said quietly. "And I'll know what to do about it." Mr. Obiora had created Adaeze Holdings Limited within a week, a shell company with opaque ownership structure, registered address at a corporate services firm in Victoria Island, purpose listed as private equity investment and venture capital. The investment documents were written in corporate legalese dense enough that an excited entrepreneur wouldn't read carefully, wouldn't notice the voting rights structure that gave the silent investor complete operational control, wouldn't understand that he was building his empire on land he didn't own. The money had flowed to Chidi through a series of wire transfers accompanied by official letters praising his impressive business acumen and strategic vision, explaining that the anonymous high-net-worth individual investor had been particularly impressed by your market analysis and growth projections. Adaeze had watched her husband receive the news, had seen the euphoria transform his entire being, had listened to him call family members and friends to share his triumph, attributing everything to hard work, faith, and God's divine favor. She'd cooked his favorite ofensala that night, had smiled and celebrated alongside him, had made love to her husband while their daughter kicked gently between them, had whispered congratulations while carefully, deliberately, choosing not to tell him the truth. The test had begun. And now, 3.5 years later, standing in their living room watching him pack his Louis Vuitton suitcase to leave her for Ngozi, Adaeze finally had her answer. Chidi Okafor had failed spectacularly, and the time for silence was over.